The dust settled on Main Street like a shroud over the living and the dead alike. Jacob Thornton stood outside the Mercantile, his weathered hands gripping the wooden post that held up the awning, watching as another family loaded their wagon, and prepared to leave redemption behind. He'd seen it happen a dozen times in the past 6 months. Good folks, driven out by drought, desperation, or dreams gone sour in this unforgiving land. He didn't blame them. Sometimes he wondered why he stayed himself. Jacob was 42 years old, though the lines carved into his face by wind and grief suggested a man much older. His ranch, the Broken Star, sprawled across 3,000 acres of Texas scrubland that had once seemed like paradise. He'd built it with his late wife Sarah, stone by stone, fence post by fence post, through years of backbreaking labor and stubborn hope. They'd had plans for that land. Plans for children running through the tall grass, for a legacy that would outlast them both. But Sarah had died bringing their stillborn son into the world 5 years ago, and Jacob had died right alongside her in every way that mattered. He still breathed, still worked, still went through the motions of living, but the spark that made life worth living had been buried with them in the little cemetery on the hillside overlooking his land. The other ranchers treated him with a mixture of respect and pity. They invited him to Sunday dinners and town gatherings, but Jacob always found excuses to decline. He preferred the company of his cattle and his memories, even though both were dwindling. The drought had been merciless this year, and he'd lost nearly a third of his herd. The bank was circling like vultures, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they came to pick his bones clean like everyone else's. It was on a scorching Tuesday afternoon in August when Jacob first saw her. He'd come into town for supplies and found himself drawn to the commotion outside the Lucky Strike saloon. A crowd had gathered, and through the press of bodies, he could see a makeshift auction block that made his stomach turn. A slave auction, though they didn't call it that anymore. This was 1873, and slavery had been abolished, but that didn't stop desperate circumstances from creating similar horrors under different names. 3 women stood on that platform, their eyes downcast, their dignity stripped away for the entertainment and commerce of lesser men. But it was the youngest one who caught Jacob's attention. She couldn't have been more than 25, with dark hair that had once been carefully arranged, but now hung in tangled waves around a face that was both beautiful and haunted. Her dress, though worn and faded, had been mended with meticulous care. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and Jacob could see them trembling despite her obvious effort to stand tall. The auctioneer, a greasy man named Pike whom Jacob had never liked, was describing her like she was livestock. Indentured servant, gentleman. 7 years of service to pay off her late husband's gambling debts. She can cook, clean, sew, and she's strong enough for field work if you need it. Let's start the bidding at $50. Jacob felt sick. He'd heard of such arrangements becoming more common as the economy tightened its noose around the territory. People sold themselves or their family members into years of servitude to pay off debts, and the law looked the other way because it was technically voluntary. The woman on the platform didn't look like she'd volunteered for anything. The bidding started, and Jacob watched in growing disgust as men he'd known for years called out prices, their eyes roaming over the woman with unmistakable intent. Old Ben Cartwright offered $60, leering as he did so. Frank Jessup, who already worked 3 Chinese laborers to death on his railroad spur, called out $75. The woman's face had gone pale, but she kept her chin up, staring at something far beyond the crowd, beyond the town, perhaps beyond this whole miserable situation. Jacob didn't plan to bid. He didn't need a servant, didn't want the responsibility of another person depending on him. He'd failed Sarah, he'd failed their son. He had no business taking on someone else's welfare. But when the bidding reached $90 and Pike started to bring his gavel down in Cartwright's favor, Jacob heard his own voice cut through the crowd. $150. The crowd fell silent and turned to look at him. Even the woman on the platform raised her eyes, searching the faces until she found his. For a moment, their gazes locked, and Jacob saw something flicker in her expression. Not gratitude, not hope exactly, but perhaps the faintest recognition that here was a man different from the others shouting prices. Pike's face split into a grin. 150 from Jacob Thornton. Do I hear 160? Cartwright looked like he wanted to continue, but something in Jacob's stance made him reconsider. Jacob wasn't a violent man by nature, but he was tall and broad-shouldered, and there was a hardness in his eyes that came from having nothing left to lose. Cartwright spat in the dust and turned away. Sold to Jacob Thornton for $150. 20 minutes later, Jacob stood in Pike's cramped office, counting out bills he couldn't really afford while the woman waited outside. Pike slid the papers across the desk, grinning like he'd pulled off a great trick. 7 years of service, all legal and binding. She tries to run, the law brings her back. She don't work, you can dock her food. You get the idea. Jacob didn't touch the papers. What's her name? Pike blinked, clearly not expecting the question. Name? Oh, it's on the papers there. Elena Vasquez. Her husband was Manuel Vasquez, died in a card game gone bad about 6 weeks back. Owed money all over town. This was the only way to settle it. She agreed to this. Well, it was this or debtor's prison, and women don't fare too well in those places, if you catch my meaning. So yeah, she agreed. Pike pushed the papers closer. You want her or not? Jacob picked up the papers, folded them without reading them, and walked out. Elena stood by his wagon, her few possessions tied in a cloth bundle at her feet. She looked up as he approached, and he could see the fear she was trying to hide behind a mask of stoic acceptance. Mom, he said, nodding to her. I'm Jacob Thornton. I have a ranch about 10 miles south of here. The Broken Star. You'll have your own room in the main house, and you'll eat what I eat. I expect the house kept clean and meals prepared, and if you can help with the mending and such, I'd appreciate it. But I'm not a hard master, and I won't tolerate anyone on my land being mistreated. That includes you. Elena studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for deception or hidden cruelty. Finally, she nodded. Thank you, Sr. Thornton. Jacob's fine. She picked up her bundle, and he helped her into the wagon. They rode in silence through the dusty streets and out into the open country. Jacob couldn't think of anything to say that wouldn't sound foolish or presumptuous, and Elena seemed lost in thoughts of her own. It wasn't until they were halfway to the ranch, with nothing around them but rolling hills and the endless sky, that she spoke. Why did you buy me? Jacob kept his eyes on the road. Didn't seem right what was happening there. But you spent money you might need. I saw your face when you were counting it out. That was not easy money for you to give. No, he admitted. It wasn't. So why? Jacob finally looked at her. Because I've lost things, Mom. Important things. And I guess I got tired of watching other people lose things when maybe, just maybe, I could stop it from happening. Elena considered this, then nodded slowly. You loved your wife very much. It wasn't a question, but Jacob answered anyway. I did. How'd you know? A man does not become as sad as you are without having loved someone very much. They didn't speak again until they reached the Broken Star. The ranch house was a sturdy timber and stone structure that Jacob and Sarah had built in better days. It needed work now. The paint was peeling. The garden had gone to weeds, and there was a general air of neglect that spoke of a man too lost in his grief to care about such things. But the bones of it were good, and Elena nodded approvingly as she took it in. Jacob showed her to the spare bedroom, a small but clean space with a window overlooking the western hills. It had been meant for the children who never came. He'd kept it closed off for years, but he'd spent the past 2 hours before his trip to town airing it out and making sure it was habitable. It wasn't much, but it was private and safe. I'll leave you to settle in, he said. There's no rush on supper. Whenever you're ready. Elena set down her bundle and turned to face him. Say, or Jacob, I need you to understand something. I will work hard for you. I will earn what you paid, every penny of it. But I will not. I am not. She struggled for the words, her face flushing. I know, Jacob said quietly, cutting her off before she had to say it. That's not why I brought you here. You have my word on that, and I don't give my word lightly." The relief in her eyes was palpable. She nodded, blinking back tears. "Thank you." The first weeks were awkward, full of careful politeness and cautious distance. Alina proved to be an excellent cook, transforming Jacob's bachelor fare of burned beans and tough meat into proper meals that reminded him of better days. She cleaned the house with a thoroughness that gradually brought it back to life, though Jacob noticed she left Sarah's things exactly where they'd been gathering dust. She was smart enough to recognize that some ghosts needed to be dealt with by the person they haunted, not by a stranger with good intentions. Jacob tried to maintain his old routines, rising before dawn, working until exhaustion claimed him, falling into bed without speaking more than a dozen words to Elena in a day. But her presence in the house created small changes he couldn't ignore. There was fresh coffee waiting for him in the morning. His clothes were mended without him asking. The house smelled like bread and herbs instead of dust and decay. It unsettled him because it felt like a betrayal of Sarah's memory, but it also reminded him of what it felt like to have a life instead of just an existence. Elena asked for nothing and complained about nothing, but Jacob noticed things. She woke sometimes in the night, and he could hear her crying softly in her room. She flinched whenever he moved too quickly. She ate like someone who'd known real hunger, savoring every bite with a gratitude that shamed him. One evening, about a month after she'd arrived, he found her in the small cemetery where Sarah and the baby were buried. She was pulling weeds from around the stones, her fingers gentle on the weathered markers. "Thought you might like them tended," she said when she noticed him. "My Manuel is buried in town. I understand why it matters." Jacob swallowed hard. "Thank you. Your wife's name was Sarah."
Yeah.
"Sarah Ann Thornton. She was 28 when she died. Should have had 50 more years at least." Alina stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. "I was married to Manuel for 3 years. He was a good man when I met him, but somewhere along the way, he found the bottom of too many bottles and too many card games. I loved him, but by the end, I think I loved the memory of who he'd been more than who he'd become." She looked at Jacob. "Grief is strange. Sometimes we grieve the person. Sometimes we grieve the future we thought we'd have. I think maybe you grieve both. You're pretty wise for someone so young. I'm not that young anymore. This land ages people fast." That conversation opened a door neither of them had expected. They began talking during meals, sharing stories about their lives before. Elena told him about growing up in San Antonio, about her father who'd been a blacksmith and her mother who'd made the most beautiful lace. Jacob told her about building the ranch, about the early days when it seemed like anything was possible. They discovered they both loved thunderstorms, both hated whiskey, both found peace in the stars. The drought broke in October, bringing rains that turned the parched earth green again. Jacob's herd began to recover, and with it, his fortunes improved slightly. He noticed he was smiling more, laughing occasionally at Alina's dry observations about life. She had a wit that caught him off guard, and a strength that became more evident as she relaxed around him. She started helping with the ranch work, proving herself capable with horses and surprisingly good at mending fences. She worked alongside him without complaint and slowly, almost imperceptibly. They became partners rather than master and servant. It was in December when things came to a head. Jacob had gone into town for the winter supplies and returned to find Elena in the kitchen, baking Christmas cookies, despite the fact that neither of them had mentioned the holiday. The smell hit him like a fist to the gut. Sarah had always baked the same cookies, the same recipe passed down from her grandmother. He stood in the doorway, frozen, as memories crashed over him. Elena turned and saw his face. Understanding dawned in her eyes, and she quickly wiped her hands on her apron. "I'm sorry. I didn't think. I should have asked." "No," Jacob said, his voice rough. "No, it's fine. It's just, Sarah used to make these. I know. I found the recipe in her handwriting in the cupboard. I thought," Elena's voice trailed off. "I thought maybe it was time." "Time for what?" "Time for you to remember the happy things instead of just the sad ones." Time to let her memory bring you joy instead of pain. Time to— She paused, choosing her words carefully. Time to live again. Jacob. Something broke inside him then, something that had been cracked and damaged but holding on through sheer stubbornness. He felt tears on his face before he realized he was crying, really crying for the first time since Sarah died. Elena moved to him, wrapping her arms around him without asking permission, and he buried his face in her shoulder and wept for all the loss, all the loneliness, all the wasted years. When the storm passed, they sat at the kitchen table together, eating cookies and drinking coffee, and Jacob told her everything. About the day Sarah died, about how he'd held his stillborn son and felt the world collapse around him, about the guilt he'd carried, convinced that somehow he should have been able to save them, about the years of just going through the motions, waiting for the day he could finally rest and see them again. Elena listened, holding his hand across the table, and when he finished, she shared her own story. About Manuel's decline, about the mounting debts, about the night he'd been killed in a bar fight over a card game, about standing in that auction square, trying to decide if she had the courage to choose prison instead, knowing what happened to women there, about seeing Jacob in the crowd and recognizing something in his eyes, a kind of brokenness that matched her own. "We're survivors, you and I," she said. "We've been through hell, but we're still here. That has to mean something." "What does it mean?" Elena smiled, and Jacob realized it was the first time he'd seen her smile without reservation. "It means we get to decide what comes next. It means we don't have to let our past define our futures. It means maybe, just maybe, we get a second chance." That night marked a turning point. They continued their routines, but the weight that had hung over the house began to lift. Jacob started taking care of his appearance again, cleaning up for meals, noticing when Elena wore a different dress or put flowers on the table. Elena began singing while she worked, old Spanish songs from her childhood that filled the house with life. They worked side by side on the ranch, building it back up, making plans for the spring. The town noticed the change too. When Jacob brought Elena to the Christmas service at the little church, eyebrows raised. He introduced her not as his servant, but as his partner in running the ranch. And he made it clear through his bearing and his words that anyone who had a problem with that could take it up with him personally. Some of the old biddies whispered, but most folks just nodded. They'd seen enough of life's hardships to begrudge two people finding a bit of comfort. Winter gave way to spring, and the ranch prospered. Jacob hired 2 hands to help with the increased workload, and the Broken Star began to look like a real operation again. He'd been so focused on the work that he didn't notice when his feelings for Elena shifted from gratitude and friendship into something deeper. It wasn't until a traveling medicine salesman came through and started paying Elena obvious attention that Jacob felt a surge of jealousy, so strong it startled him. That evening, after the salesman had left, Jacob found Elena on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. He sat beside her, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't since he was a young man courting Sarah. "Elena," he said, "I need to tell you something." She turned to look at him, something guarded in her expression. "What is it?" "Your 7 years. The contract. I want to tear it up." Her face fell, and Jacob realized she'd misunderstood. "You want me to leave?" "No, please no." "I want you to stay, but not because of some paper that says you have to. I want—" He took a deep breath. "I want you to be free to choose. And then, if you're willing, I want you to choose to stay. Not as a servant, not as someone paying off a debt, but as someone who wants to be here, with me." Elena's eyes widened. "Jacob, are you saying—" "I'm saying I love you." The words tumbled out before he could second-guess them. "I know it's too soon. I know you might not feel the same way. I know I'm older than you and probably too set in my ways, and still carrying around more ghosts than any person should. But somewhere along the way, you stopped being just someone I took pity on. You became the reason I wake up in the morning. You taught me that it's okay to laugh again, to plan for tomorrow, to want things. You taught me how to live again, Elena and I." He stopped, overwhelmed by his own confession. Elena reached out and cupped his face in her hand, her thumb brushing away a tear he hadn't realized was there. "You foolish man," she said softly. "Don't you know? I've been in love with you for months. I was just too afraid to hope that you might feel the same way." They married in April, in the same little church where Jacob had married Sarah 20 years before. Some people thought it was scandalous how quickly it happened, but Jacob didn't care. He'd wasted enough time being afraid to be happy. Elena wore a simple white dress she'd sewn herself, and she carried wildflowers from the hills around the ranch. Jacob wore his best suit, the one he'd kept packed away since Sarah's funeral, and when he looked at Elena walking toward him, he felt like he was being given a gift he didn't deserve, but would cherish every day of his remaining life. Before the ceremony, Jacob had taken Elena to the cemetery. Together they'd stood before Sarah's grave, and Jacob had spoken to his first wife for the final time. "I'll always love you, Sarah," he'd said. "You'll always be a part of me. But I need to live again, and Elena, she's my chance to do that. I think you'd like her. I think you'd understand." Elena had placed flowers on the grave, and as they walked away hand in hand, Jacob felt something shift inside him. It wasn't that the pain disappeared entirely. It never would. But it transformed into something bearable, something that could coexist with joy and hope and love. The years that followed were good ones. The ranch continued to prosper, growing from a struggling operation into one of the most successful in the territory. Jacob and Elena worked side by side, building something that belonged to both of them. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, who filled the house with laughter and chaos and life. Jacob taught them to ride and work the land, while Elena taught them to be kind and strong and never take their blessings for granted. On warm summer evenings, Jacob and Elena would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over their land, their children playing in the yard, their hands intertwined. Sometimes Jacob would think about that day in town, when he'd paid money he couldn't afford for a woman he didn't know. Driven by nothing more than pity, and a vague sense that he needed to do something right in a world that felt increasingly wrong. "What are you thinking about?" Elena would ask, knowing that look in his eyes. "About the day we met," he'd always answer. "About how I thought I was saving you." Elena would smile and squeeze his hand. "We saved each other, my love. That's how the best stories go." And Jacob would nod, because she was right. He'd bought her out of pity, thinking he was doing a good deed, thinking maybe he could prevent one more person from losing everything in this harsh, unforgiving land. But Elena had given him something far more valuable than whatever those 7 years of service would have been worth. She'd given him back his life, his hope, his ability to love and be loved. She'd taught him that grief doesn't have to be the end of the story, that it's possible to honor the past while embracing the future, that the human heart has a remarkable capacity to heal and grow and love again. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to appear, Jacob Thornton would often reflect on the strange and wonderful path that had led him here. He'd lost Sarah and their child, and that loss would always be a part of him, a scar on his heart that had shaped who he became. But he'd found Elena, and together they'd built something beautiful from the ashes of their separate tragedies. They'd created a family, a home, a legacy that would outlast them both. The Broken Star Ranch still stands today, passed down through generations of Thorntons, each one carrying forward the story of how their family began. It started with an act of pity that became an act of love, with 2 broken people who found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and chose to heal together. It's a reminder that sometimes the best things in life come from the moments when we step outside our own pain to help someone else, and that in doing so, we often end up helping ourselves. Jacob Thornton died at the age of 76, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, with Elena holding his hand the way she'd held it that first night when he'd broken down over Christmas cookies. He died happy, his life full and complete, so different from the hollow existence he'd been living when he'd first seen her standing on that auction block. And as for Elena, she lived another 15 years after Jacob passed, running the ranch with the help of her sons, making sure that the legacy they'd built together continued to thrive. She never remarried, though she had offers. When asked why, she would smile and say that she'd already had 2 great loves in her life, and that was more than most people ever get. She'd say that Jacob had given her back her dignity, her freedom, and her future, and that she'd given him back his life. It had been a fair trade, she'd say, the best trade she'd ever made. The story of Jacob and Elena Thornton became legend in that part of Texas, passed down as a reminder that love can bloom in the most unexpected places, that redemption is always possible, and that sometimes the best way to heal yourself is to help someone else heal first. It's a story about the Wild West, but it's also a universal story about the resilience of the human spirit, about second chances, and about the transformative power of love and compassion. In the end, Jacob hadn't just bought Elena out of pity that day. He'd bought himself a second chance at life, though he didn't know it at the time, and Elena hadn't just gained her freedom when Jacob tore up that contract. She'd gained a partner, a family, and a love that proved that even in the harshest landscape, with the odds stacked against you, it's still possible to build something beautiful. Together, they'd taken their broken pieces and created something whole, something that endured long after they were gone, a testament to the idea that it's never too late to start living again.